All right, folks, we're going to go ahead and get going. Those of you in the back of the room, if you could go ahead and take a seat. I want to be respectful of our folks that are on the live stream to make sure that we begin as close to on time as possible. I think one of the hardest things is to get folks back after a nice lunch. So appreciate you in the room. Just want to make a couple comments about what we heard this morning, and especially in this last panel. One was around progress, not perfection. And one of the things that Paul talked about from Zaptec was that, hey, there is still an opportunity for OEMs to participate in terms of providing their feedback, their guidance in terms of the initial draft technical specification for EV chargers that has been completed, the initial draft, like I said. And I think that that's important to do from the perspective of to make sure your voice is heard. You want to be at the table, you want a voice in what is being shaped for the future, because we do believe that as an OEM, you're going to benefit from it. But I think the other key point that came out was really that, hey, regardless of what technology you might represent, heat pump, EV charger, heat pump, water heater, et cetera, there's value to participating right now in terms of the Mercury Consortium. So I'm hoping that we can have our OEMs hear that and realize the value of participation is now and the importance of them jumping in on this effort based upon the risk reward that we talked about. The last item I wanted to mention is around the consumer. The consumer is incredibly important. We've talked about it as a key driving feature. OEMs talked about how they needed to create awareness around what we can accomplish with our consumers, either from a price perspective or in terms of participating in energy markets, et cetera, from these load flexible technologies. I think the other area that we think about is the utility and the utility-consumer relationship and how important it is in terms of driving adoption and then ultimately participation in some of the programs that we're going to talk about. So our next panel that's going to be moderated by Bennett Richardson, who is General Manager of Semaphore, is a utility panel. And it involves not only U.S. utility, but it also involves some utility or E.ON Next from Europe. So we have the opportunity here a little bit more of a global perspective. I do believe it's important, once again, to think about the role of the utility in terms of driving ultimate consumer behaviors, whether it be price signals, incentives, et cetera. So with that, let me introduce Bennett Richardson, General Manager of Semaphore, and then Bennett will introduce the panel. Bennett, come on up.
Thanks so much, Rob. Thank you all for being here. As Rob alluded to, I think this is probably the most important panel of the day, not because I'm moderating it, but because getting the voice of the utilities and that end consumer is so important to making all of this work. We have an all-star panel to speak to that. I will introduce them quickly and then invite them to say a few words about their roles at their respective utilities. Joining us remotely from California, we've got Chanel Parson, Director of Clean Energy and Demand Response from Southern California Edison. Next to me here, we've got Britt Reichborn-Kennerud from Con Edison, the Director of E-Mobility, as well as Yonadav Yuval, who's joining us from the UK, from E.ON Next, where he's the Product Director for Growth and Innovation. And before we dive in, you all have unique perches at each of your utilities, as well as some sort of unique nuances to the work that you're doing. So Chanel, would love to just invite you to tell folks a little bit more about your role at Southern California Edison.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. So yes, at Southern California Edison, my role is Director of Clean Energy and Demand Response. In that role, I manage over $1 billion in programming to help support clean energy adoption, and also how we work with our customers to partner with them to use their DERs to support affordability, reliability, and readiness of the grid. And so I have responsibility for transportation electrification programs, including vehicle grid integration. I have responsibility for demand response programs, including virtual power plants. I have responsibility for customer generation and storage programs and incentives as well, and actively working to build out Southern California Edison's demand flexibility strategy.
Great, thank you, Chanel. Britt, tell us more about your role here in New York at Con Edison.
So I'm Director of E-Mobility. So my primary responsibility is helping push forward the clean transportation transition, partly through expanding infrastructure and really moving the market to build out EV charging in New York City, and then also considering how EV charging integrates with the grid. So we have a suite now of 3 different smart charge programs that focus on behavioral programs for customers to avoid grid peak periods, move their charging to overnight, as well as a smart charge technology program where we incentivize the enabling technologies like software, batteries, other load management hardware. And then I work really closely with distribution planning, and we're thinking a lot about how we're preparing the grid. You know, we need this load flexibility because we've turned the corner of EV adoption, and now we're in that steeper rise. Even if there are some headwinds today, we really have turned that corner. And so how do we think thoughtfully about integrating with the grid while also preparing the grid ahead of time? Because this EV load can come on extremely quickly. Those charging stations, skyscraper, can be built in a day. So the load flexibility is really important for that.
Great, thanks, Britt. Yonadav, tell us more about your work across the pond.
So I head up a little team, a new team in E.ON called Growth Studio. It's an internal incubator and accelerator. We are looking at, I think, everything that's been mentioned here. So we've got some programs for consumer flexibility. We've got some programs at city scale, community flexibility, and we're now getting into CNI as well. Obviously, this is an incredible area of opportunity and importance for us and for our consumers and for the industry. I think as a utility, we have an incredibly important role to play in bringing those together from a customer perspective, and that's exactly what my team is on the hook for.
That's great. Well, thank you all. We've got some great perspectives here and want to dive right in. Chanel, I want to start with you and go back to something that you mentioned. You kind of articulated your remit as balancing all of these key priorities, you know, reliability, affordability. You had one more IDI that I'm now forgetting, but we'll start with those two anyway. Obviously, being at a utility, a major utility like Southern California Edison, you know, integrating these new, diverse, flexible load devices, you can't sacrifice that reliability or that customer experience as all of these new things are coming online. So I would just love to hear a little bit from you on the front lines of this, of like, how are you approaching this challenge of integrating this diverse array of new devices, but doing it in a way that stays pretty seamless and pretty, mission, keeping it steady for the customer?
Yeah, a great question. So, unlocking the scale of demand flexibility is really an imperative for us. In California, we have goals to reach carbon neutrality by 2045. And we've done analysis that says we're going to see demand increase twofold. In order to meet that, if we did build out the grid the traditional way that you build out the grid, and it's been done for over 100 years, it would mean that we would have to 4x the pace of our transmission grid build out and 7 to 10x the pace of our distribution grid build out to accommodate all of this additional load. And so we know that we don't have the time to do that, permitting, construction. We don't have the money to do that. Affordability is very important for us and for our customers. And so we know we have to do things differently to meet the need. And unlocking demand flex is one of those. So I start with saying it is a priority for us. We know also that being able to shift, shape, shed, and shimmy load will help with affordability, reliability, and readiness. The affordability piece is if we can procure less energy at peaks, it's cheaper for all customers, not just those who have DERs. If we can defer or eliminate distribution grid upgrades, installing a new larger transformer, for example, that's also going to save money for all customers, not just those who have DERs. And then if we're able to really manage and shape the demand curve, that third one is readiness. It's going to allow us to connect new load faster. And we have a flexible interconnection program now where maybe we don't have all of the megawatts of customers requesting at the site today, but we can interconnect them today or figuratively today, and allow them to use a certain amount of load with a load control management system until we're able to get the rest. But but unlocking demand flex will help us have the grid ready for new load. And the way that we've been approaching it is we're looking at load management in 3 buckets. You have traditional demand response, which is bulk system event based. That works really, really well for what we needed to, and ISO manages the bulk system load. We have what I call behavioral, where customers get information or a signal, and they we hope they do something with it. And then you have what we're defining as demand flex, which is automated control 24/7, 365 at the distribution local grid level. And so I'm working with partners in our corporate strategy and in our system planning and engineering teams to build out what our strategy is for that at Edison, because we've learned that dynamic rates don't change behavior very well. We've learned that automated is superior to behavioral, because if we're going to get to a place where we can eliminate or defer distribution grid upgrades or change our procurement approach, we need to have predictability and reliability of how much we can predict the load and the demand curve. Um, and we've learned that our customers want to set it and forget it. They don't want to have to think about, do I charge my car at 8 p.m., 9 p.m., 10 p.m., or 11? Really, for our residential customers, they really would like the ability to say, I'm going to plug my car in at 5 p.m. I need to leave at 7. As long as it's charged to 80% by the time I leave at 7, I don't care what you do with it in between. And so we are working to build out a strategy that includes the technology considerations, the customer considerations, policy considerations, money. We need incentives to incentivize early adopters to help us learn quickly, and collaboration with partners, OEMs, service providers, other utilities, and regulators.
Thanks, Chanel. Britt, we mentioned the kind of the demand challenge there with EVs at the end with Chanel. I am guilty of exactly what she just described. I drive an EV. I never think twice about when I'm plugging it in compared to demand and rates. And so would just love to hear from you, like from your perch, how are you thinking about this integration challenge and how it relates to that end customer experience on the EV side?
Yeah, I think there's so many things that need to happen, and some of them need to happen within the utility, and some of them need to happen externally. So you have the customer side. We need compelling programs to get you to adopt the right technologies up front. So we're thinking about technology-specific programs, recognizing sort of the uniqueness of different enabling technologies, and then also a technology-agnostic performance incentive. And that's really the best way to recognize the value, sort of in a technology-agnostic way, that grid flexibility can deliver. We're also thinking, how is this gonna happen? How do, grid flexibility that I want to see at any given time of day get you to do something, right, with your EV charging. And so we're thinking not about the utility being connected to every single heater, EV charger out there, battery, but rather creating a market of aggregators, very much like we've seen with demand response, which is really event-based, and going sort of creating an aggregator of aggregators approach, where we as a utility work with the aggregators, and those aggregators deliver some portfolio of grid flexibility. So that's the external view. And then when we think internally, we have to have some way of seeing what's happening out there. We need the visibility, and we also need the controls. Those signals will send to those aggregators. So we're building up in phases our DER management systems, our DERMS, and we've already started that process. And the idea is that it's iterative, and we're developing different modules and then putting them in production as they're completed, because this is sort of a very long-term project. And lastly, a big part of this is planning. If we're not considering grid flexibility in our planning, then we're not really gonna leverage a lot of the benefits, whether those might be on the local delivery system, or actually we're seeing, as time evolves and the energy system becomes more intermittent, that value is gonna be marching from the load side to the generation side of the energy system. And so, to really understand what can we depend on, you talk about reliability with Chanel, what can we really rely on the customer to do? What will these aggregators actually deliver? We need a lot of experience. So we're trying to launch programs early collect a lot of data and want to do pilots as well as studies to build that picture and gain confidence in what does this resource actually look like and how do we incorporate it into planning.
Oh, that's great. I want to just quickly double click on that aggregator model, because that seems like a pretty kind of novel and a bit of an evolution, right, in terms of utilities for so long being, you know, those buyers of all these different energy sources and then bringing them to the consumer, working with that market, that network, and building out these aggregators. Just would love to just share a little bit about how that came about and how you sort of built towards that aggregator model.
Yeah, I think there's this understanding that we know what the grid needs. We know what price signals we want to send. Certainly there are some price signals embedded in rates. We can really tailor those signals through programs. And so that's really a great role for the utility. But in terms of considering, you know, what really could be, you know, hundreds of thousands, millions of energy endpoints, you know, for the utility to be talking to every one of those points isn't necessarily the most efficient thing. Aggregators, this market, on the other hand, they've demonstrated the capability of working with the end user through demand response programs. So we think that that model actually has been successful. And that way, you know, we create that layer. That's their competency. They've really demonstrated that. They're best positioned to put together these portfolios and dispatch them when we need them.
Makes a lot of sense. I feel like there's oftentimes such a temptation to get into all of these different layers of the grid.
To be right there. Yeah.
To be right there,
Yeah.
to be sort of something to everyone, but it seems like a
Yep.
specialization model that's working well here.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Yonadav, would love to unpack how this is working in the UK with you all, because there's so much sort of nuance and difference there. We were talking backstage a little bit about the difference on the demand, the dynamic rate side, but from your perch in the growth studio, like, how much are you thinking about just pure innovation and these new diverse sources and programs versus the actual integration, and like how does that kind of come together in your world?
So we're going to start from the customer end, really, which is the way we're thinking about customers is we kind of have these two dimensions, or ladders we call them, that we think customers have to climb, or we have to help them climb. One is the asset ladder, so they need to decarbonize, they need to get a heat pump, get an EV, battery devices, if you like, thermostats, etc. And then the other dimension we're thinking of is in terms of change of behavior. So there's from the completely unengaged through the somewhat engaged to the, you know, very engaged, and we're looking at the best times to speak to customers about taking that next step in one of those ladders. And I think this is kind of like where the integration points come in, because at the moment it's our overriding mission in E.ON is sustainable, affordable, sustainable energy for all. So we really try and find, if you think about this two-dimensional space, we're looking for solutions, for different segments, if you like. And this is where integration really harms us, because, you know, there's this technology provider that will speak to those heat pumps, and there's this other technology provider that will only speak to these EVs. And we're thinking, again, coming at it from the customer perspective, you know, what does the customer do? I can sign up with E.ON, but then I can't sign up with somebody else. So if I buy this solar panel, then it's not going to work with, you know, somebody else. But, you know, so I think this is really harming us as a supplier. There is a lot of confusion if you go onto online communities, and the horror stories that we get from customers about, I'm just trying, I want to have solar panels, I want to have a battery, they tell me I can save all this money, but I don't know where to start. I go through all these websites, all these communities, and everybody's got their own horror stories. So I think just specifically to the point about integration, you know, this is a blocker for us. You know, in order for us to achieve deliver all of those benefits to customers, deliver the decarbonization of society, make people participate in the energy transition, we absolutely have got to unblock this integration challenge, because otherwise we're all just going to be still, you know, selling a few solar panels here, a few tariffs there. Really, to get it across from early adopters to mass market, that's the first problem we have to solve. Yeah, if we want to solve it at a large scale, make affordable energy sustainable for all.
Absolutely. Well, and you touched on something there that I think is really important for us to talk about as you move from those early adopters to the mass market. And it's almost shaping that customer behavior versus meeting that customer behavior where it is. And Britt, would love to start with you, and then Chanel, really excited to get your perspective on this as well. But that has to be a fundamental challenge and sometimes conflicting priorities for utilities. You want to adopt these standards. You want to be as innovative as possible. But at the same time, you need to remain as neutral as you can. And then obviously you have to, I mean, we were just talking about rates and how they can affect these behaviors. You have to stay customer focused. Like, how are you thinking about that? And how do you see as the role of utilities influencing that interoperability? Because it seems like that's a really hard kind of three-dimensional challenge to juggle.
Yeah, it is tricky because if you push towards standards or say limit your programs to just a few participants, you might have this really like elegant, seamless integration. But we really want to get those large data sets that I mentioned, and we also want to get all customers thinking from day one about load management. And so you know, it's been a success story, but also a little bit of a cautionary tale. We launched this program, Smart Charge Commercial. We said we want a commercial managed charging program. We want a broadly available program. It shouldn't depend on what charger you happen to install. We don't want anybody locked out because of a decision they made a few years ago. You know, there are some requirements to the network you choose, but often, you know, customers can make those choices if they want to participate. And we offer commercial managed charging, peak avoidance for 4 hours for the local network peak, plus we pay another 3 cents per kilowatt hour for every bit that's charged overnight from midnight to 8 a.m. That program, currently the customers upload the data to a custom platform that we created. There was no provider that could provide a broad solution to many different EV charging stations, and this is, you know, any station can participate from, you know, curbside, public charging, fast charging hub, apartment building, workplace fleets. The program's been extremely popular. About the quarter of the kilowatts installed in our service area signed up since it was launched in January last year. So we've gotten that many participants to sign up because of this broad solution, but it is really clunky and the customer experience isn't great. We're working now to develop an API, at least to smooth that. If they're separately metered, we do the data ingestion for them. So we're always looking for solutions to improve the customer experience, but we had to sacrifice that a little bit to create this broad program and get that engagement that really the market has showed up, and they really want a program like this.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a really strong market signal if you have a somewhat clunky solution, but you're still seeing adoption. That just speaks to the appetite.
How appealing it is, yeah, absolutely.
Chanel, lots to unpack here, but tell us about it, Edison. How are you thinking about this challenge, maintaining some level of neutrality, but wanting to kind of capture the benefits of all these new technologies, and then still keeping that customer, you know, affordability obsession?
Yeah, so in thinking about the customer, what we've learned in various demand response programs is our customers want the to participate. They want it to be affordable, easy, and comfortable. We've learned if it isn't giving them the financial benefit, or if they're taking a financial hit from it, if it's not affordable for them, they're uninterested. They will, you know, unenroll from programs. We've learned that if it's not easy, it's too hard to figure it out. It's too hard to participate. It's too hard to figure out how much you're going to get. They will leave the programs or not join. And then they want to be comfortable. If it's an AC cycling program and their AC is turned off too much, they will leave the program. So those are three kind of pillars that we look at that the customer, you know, wants to participate in. And we also realize not one size fits all. Our residential customers and our commercial industrial customers have different needs and desires. And so that plays into the rates and the behaviors and the tests and pilots that we are doing. So, for example, dynamic rates is thought of in some circles to be the answer to demand flexibility. And we know that for some commercial industrial customers, they will employ an energy management system. They will hire a person or two to manage their energy on a small increment basis, a 15-minute, 30-minute, hour basis, because it is very meaningful to their bottom line to do that. For a lot of residential customers, however, they don't want to think about their energy usage on 15-minute, 30-minute, or hour increments. And it is more helpful for them to set it and forget it. And so having both dynamic rates and flexible rates, which are more time of use broadband, where it's the same price, will be important to how we make this work. And the flexible rates, as I'm calling them, allows for the utility to send signals when it's appropriate to charge the EVs on this circuit, and it might be a different time on another circuit and another circuit. So it really allows us the flexibility to do that and not being constrained by the cost, because customers are always going to want to maximize their bottom line. And the other piece that I think is the challenge we're working to ever overcome, and it's really kind of what Britt mentioned, is how are we able to test, pilot, and learn, and do this quickly and do this with some scale. And I know the regulatory process is a very important process, but sometimes it does slow down our ability to very quickly learn, test new things, do new pilots, do new programs at a larger scale to help us where we ultimately need to go with demand flexibility. So those are the pieces we're working through. I will say on the interoperability piece, it's very critical. If we look at electric vehicles, for example, as we are now getting more and more customers interested in using their vehicle bidirectionally, our engineering department has to review and test multiple times each bidirectional system to ensure that it's going to behave the way that it's supposed to behave with our grid and it doesn't cause damage to the grid using it bidirectionally. And so if we're going through the process of testing each OEM system multiple times and approving it, and all of the various utilities are doing that, because right now most utilities don't accept that another utility's done it, so it's okay, right? We all have slightly different aspects to our grid. It really slows us down on getting to scale. It takes a lot of time, energy, resources to try to scale up, and then it's very costly. So the solution that Mercury Consortium is going to provide will help us with being able to test, pilot, and learn and scale quickly.
That's great. I want to get back to interoperability in a minute, but want to sort of diverge and focus on rates for a second, because I know it's something that you and Britt have been thinking a lot about. And Chanel, maybe just to go back to what you were saying there, seems like dynamic rates is potentially being leaned on too much as a kind of be-all, end-all solution. How did we get to that point? And how do you think this sort of new mentality around balancing dynamic rates with flexible rates will help to solve that and sort of benefit the consumer?
Yes, how we got there is I think somebody had a great idea and others thought it was great, and everyone started running in that direction. And so I don't think dynamic rates is a bad idea, but I do think that it should not be the only way that we are pursuing demand flexibility. I think there are opportunities to pursue it differently, whether it be third party aggregators, utility as an aggregator, maybe white labeling, a system that will get us better gains for some of our customer segments than dynamic rates will. And I've been trying to infuse that into the discussion, because there are a lot of policymakers, individuals who really do strongly believe in dynamic rates. I think some of the risks with dynamic rates are you can have customers with really high bills if they're mandatory. If they're not optional rates, they can have really high bills without knowing it. You have customers who are maybe income qualified customers, the less well off community, who maybe they don't have the DERs to be able to adequately control their usage. And so they may actually end up paying more for energy than more well off customers who have the ability to have devices that are smart and who can receive signals. I also think that if you have more flexible rates and you are optimizing demand flexibility to what the grid needs at the local level in real time, then you're maximizing affordability for all customers and not just optimizing affordability for the customers who are participating, the customers who are actively paying attention, or um, optimizing a financial gain for a third party who comes into the market and sees an arbitrage opportunity with the dynamic rates, and they're capturing that value for themselves rather than for all customers.
Thank you. Britt, I have to imagine this is hugely important in your world. I mean, especially as we're reaching more EV adoption. It's such a different customer experience when it comes to rates, right? You're used to going to a gas station, you can literally see what you're paying on the sign versus plugging your car in whenever you need to, and then maybe getting some sticker shock when you get that utility bill at the end of the month. Like, how are you thinking about rates and this sort of challenge and balancing of things like dynamic rates and flexible rates in your world?
Yeah, so we think about rates together with customer programs. I mentioned those operating incentives, and you have multiple tools in the toolbox. On the rate side, we want to provide rate options. We have time variable rates for all commercial customers, as well as some rates for EV charging and heating customers on the residential side. When it comes to thinking about dynamic incentives, really tailoring different sort of grid flexibility values, we think more about programs because those are a little bit easier to change. Rates are they're pretty fixed, at least over a period of years, and that's a good thing. Like, you want your pricing to be kind of predictable in a lot of ways, but you want to be able to innovate and also sort of move as the market evolves when it comes to really harnessing the grid flexibility, and that's where programs can be a little bit more flexible. Another issue with rates is that the bill payer isn't always the operator of the distributed energy resource. So take EV charging stations, the majority of them in our service area are commingled with other loads behind a meter. The EV charging station operator is not paying the bill. So, that Smart Charge commercial program, they can participate in that program working directly with us, the station operator. They don't pay the utility bill, but they're the ones we need to take action. We need them to install hardware, we need to install software, some sort of behavior change. It could be operational for a fleet. So a program actually allows us to interact with that station operator, and we can send the signals to them. They get the benefit. If a rate were the option, then they're not paying the bill. They really have no incentive to change their behavior unless they have a sophisticated enough landlord that's sort of passing on those price signals, telling them what to do. So, both options are important, and you do want to give options, but we do feel that with programs we can be a lot more innovative and sort of evolve as we learn more, and again, as that value of grid flexibility evolves over time as the energy mix and the supply evolves.
Makes sense. And having those discrete programs gives you a chance to kind of innovate or experiment kind of within the framework of that program, not try to, upend the entire way that you're approaching your customer's rate structure.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yonadav, you were getting a little wide-eyed backstage that this rate world and peaks and valleys is so central to the American energy experience. So that's not how things are working in the UK. Tell us a little bit more about, for those who are less familiar in the audience, about how those rate structures are handled in your world, and then because of that, how you're thinking about affordability as you're thinking about all the new innovations that you're bringing on to E.ON.
So it's definitely, well, I guess two differences. I think one is the location, is the geography, and how the market works. But also, I think in the UK, E.ON UK is a supplier. So we have a trading team, and our trading team looks at all of the opportunities, all of the grid opportunities, local grid, national, capacity markets, balancing markets, wholesale markets, and tries to aggregate that into basically trading opportunities. When can energy be cheapest? When it will be more expensive? We spend a lot of time forecasting what energy prices we think are going to be, or the aggregate of all of those markets is going to be. We hedge a lot, so to some extent we don't really have completely dynamic prices, or wouldn't want to offer. Either wouldn't want to or couldn't offer completely dynamic pricing in a way that maybe you can in the US or Australia or other markets. So the process starts off with like, what's our best view of pricing opportunities, if you like. We then have, I guess, 3 different models we're testing at the moment in terms of how we try and modify customer behavior based on those pricing signals. One of them is dynamic pricing or simulating dynamic pricing. There isn't really a wholesale market as such that you can say this is the price today, but we're trying to offer the customer that feels like transparent pricing and put a subscription or some kind of a fixed charge on top of it. So from a customer perspective, there's full transparency. Our pitch is like, we sell you the energy at the price at what it costs us to provide, and you only pay us £10 or $10 or $15 for the privilege. So there's full transparency, there's complete trust in terms of the proposition. I think that works really well with the top end of the market, with the more engaged customers that will have researched the market, will have gone on all the communities, will have spent a lot of time and money getting the house just the way that they want to. Whereas for the other segments, call it the mass market and the people that experiment, I think they're looking for much more predictable pricing. They're looking for more like set and forget, like charge my car to 80% by 7 o'clock. Or they're looking for some level of engagement in terms of give me some signals, tell me when I can save some money. I can go off and go see a movie or something and turn everything off in the house and get a few dollars for that. Or participate in campaigns of this nature. So yeah, we're experimenting. I think generally the research we've done suggests that fully dynamic pricing, people are worried about that, especially after the energy crisis. It's like, what happens, if I leave it completely to the markets, could I have an enormous bill one day without having any opportunity to do anything about it? We are thinking of this as kind of like a continuum where we can engineer different levels of risk so we can offer some volatility with, it's like, I don't know, like investment, you can invest in whatever stock you want, but you expect a higher volatility, or you can let us create a safer investment, but then your rewards or your risk is lower. It's just trying to find what chimes with different customers and different segments. And then I think to the point earlier about aggregators, so we kind of like moving into a model where we are aggregating ourselves. So we got, for example, we're starting off with thinking about different asset classes as different fleets. So like an EV is one fleet which behaves in a certain way and is typically more available after 5 o'clock when people come in, as opposed to in-home batteries that are always there and you can turn on and off with very little latency. So we're already starting to think about those fleets, but also in the UK the government is wanting to really promote the role not just of a supplier in the way that we are, but of aggregators. I think they want to create some competitive pressure, if you like, in the industry, and create that additional role that allows people outside the suppliers to benefit from those markets in a way that challenges the incumbents. I think the suppliers are just all going to get aggregator licenses. I'm not sure to what extent that's really going to do it, but I think the role of aggregation is really important. And if you got all of those fleets, you then need to get into aggregator of aggregator, and how do you make the right decisions between fleets? Like, do you looking at different prices? How much is your grid scale battery going to cost you to activate, as opposed to your in-home batteries, or as opposed to your EV fleet? So I think the market's just going to get more more complicated. I think the only other dimension I wanted to add to that is that for that to even be possible, there's got to be much more maturity in the way that those assets are available and those assets are accessible. I mean, at the moment, Tesla decides to rev up, a little version of the API, and all of a sudden, half your customers need to reintegrate with the app. So unless you bring the customer with us, and unless customers have that great experience with connectivity, you're not going to be able to pass all of those benefits.
Absolutely. And one of the got me thinking about two things. I think one, to that last point of friction for customers. I feel like obviously we're here, talking about the Mercury Consortium and about interoperability, and it's easy to assume at some level, especially when you're thinking about growth and innovation, that standards can slow down innovation or can slow down adoption because you need to find the ways to integrate. But I feel like so often, in talking with you all, ahead of this, sometimes that lack of interoperability is actually creating the friction. So we just would love to unpack that. And Yonadav, maybe start with you, just kind of continuing the conversation there. As you're thinking about growth and innovation from your perch running the studio, how does interoperability and lack of interoperability factor into, creating the seamless experience for customers, and how are you thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it just needs to be something that people don't even think about. I think the first point we mentioned is in terms of customer choice. So you don't want to be prevented as a supplier from taking on a customer because they got the wrong inverter or the wrong battery. You also don't want to have to deal with all of the customer complaints because their device doesn't work as well with your software as maybe it did with the other supplier or in general. You don't want to have to deal with the volatility of the APIs or into those devices that change the volatility, the kind of like the device says it worked and the customer said it didn't, and I thought my car was going to be charged and it isn't, and you can't see that in the system, and they call you and then start generating. So there's quite a lot of cost, not just integration cost, which is having to deal with new devices and new pieces of software, but a lot of support costs, because ultimately the customer was going to call you and say it didn't do what he said he was going to do, or he wasn't charged, or I couldn't go to work because my car was empty. So I think there's costs everywhere. There's a bad customer experience. And there's a lack of scalability to the industry as a whole, and the opportunity to pick up on flexibility, unless at least this very first step of the ladder of connectivity is really addressed, which is, I think, why we're here, and this is what we're trying to do. Appreciate that there's some, the history of proprietary interfaces, ultimately to reach scale, ultimately some, individual players get a benefit in the early days, but ultimately, I think we want to move on because the real set of opportunities are one and many steps beyond just that connectivity layer.
Absolutely. Chanel, want to hear from you on this as well. You had another amazing alliteration earlier, and I'm forgetting, I think, the fourth SH, but as you're shaping, shedding, shimmying, there was one more.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. But as you're working on that, talk to us about interoperability and how has both the lack of interoperability caused friction, and where are you seeing gains from bringing more interoperability into that mix?
Yeah, I think Yonadav really articulated well the customer experience piece and the cost piece. I'll add one more piece to that customer experience piece, and then I'll go behind the scenes. But one piece to add to the customer experience is this is something relatively new, And if our early adopting customers are having a bad experience, it is going to significantly slow future progress in the industry because they will tell their friends and their friends' friends and their friends' friends that they tried this managed charging program or they tried this demand flex program and it didn't work. They couldn't get to work on time or their house got too hot. And so I think it's extremely important to try to get this right early on. I will say though, from behind the scenes, I mentioned a little earlier for bidirectional EV systems, my utility has to test multiple times each system from an automaker and in order for us to certify it. Once we certify it, anyone who applies for interconnection with their system will get a fast pass, right? It'll be a rubber stamp, but it's typically a couple month process to get the device approved. And that's just that version of the device. So if that automaker comes out with a change or a new version, it has to run through this testing process all over again. And the automakers have expressed frustration because they have to do that process with us and they have to do that same process with our peer utilities because again we don't cross certify. So that really slows down progress and what getting to scale as if everyone has to test everything multiple times. um, if we have a standard, we know if it meets that standard it's good to go, it's certified, and we can give it that stamp, and so more and more people can adopt the use of this technology sooner. I will also say another example beyond EVs is smart thermostats. We currently have entered into a number of contracts with smart thermostat OEMs to operate these thermostats for our demand response programs. And so we have separate contracts because of the proprietary nature of being able to control these thermostats, that the separate contracts cost more money, as well as slows down progress in being able to from the thermostat fleet, per Yanadev's term that I really liked, being able to scale how much we can integrate thermostats into a demand flexibility strategy. So those are some additional examples of how interoperability can help with customer experience, costs, and then the timeliness to scale, because that scale is really going to get us to those affordability gains for our customers.
Thank you. Britt, I want to go back to some of the EV examples that Chanel brought up. I have two questions for you. Feel free to discard either of them and focus on one. But I guess first part, should that cross-certification happen? Like, is there an opportunity to do that? Or are utilities kind of two separate? That's the first question. And then completely different from what she was saying, I mean, are we ever going to get to a place where this proliferation of automaker by automaker, kind of charger by charger standards are just, like, will we ever see consolidation
Everything
there?
is harmonized.
Yeah, I feel like we're living in that like Apple world right now where you need like the dongle to attach to the dongle to attach to the charger.
Oh, I got
sometimes.
I now I have the new connector. I need to buy. Yeah, it's I don't have a crystal ball. I am an optimist, and I think there's two things that need to happen. First, we have to have compelling programs to really capture the value of grid flexibility. If there's money to be earned, if there's an aggregator market where those aggregators can build services that they're delivering to utilities, the end users can actually earn meaningful incentives, that's going to be a key driver. And just to go back to why we're here, you need efforts that are bringing together all the sort of market players marching in the same direction. You have your OEMs, your platform providers, your, the consumer themselves, the utilities. Everybody needs to come together and sort of agree on what are those values and what are the functionalities that need to be enabled to unlock the grid flexibility value. And something like the Mercury Consortium can play a big role in that. I think also some states, including New York State where we operate, the commissions are really taking the lead and developing dedicated proceedings. They're bringing together all these parties and starting to shape pilots, understanding the values and really defining what that value is going to look like. And so if we can wrap our arms around what those values are, we can get everybody marching in the same direction, and you have the right incentives for the OEMs, the utilities, the customers, aggregators. you can build this market, but you need to compel them all and bring them together and sort of make sure that everybody's able to access some part of that grid flexibility. Otherwise, there's really no incentive for like, you know, an OEM to just simply change the API they're using, or you know, a lot of, you know, one of our managed charging programs, we have a platform provider, but they have this like intermediate platform that they log into to get to the OEM. And so if, you know, that platform changes, then, you know, the link is broken and you have to restore it, and that's not scalable.
Totally. And I want to leave some time for questions. So if you all have questions, start noodling on them, because we're going to open it up for Q&A in just a few minutes. Speaking of compelling all these parties kind of come to the table and work on this, big opportunity for that is obviously the role of government and the role of policy. And would love, and I'll start with my Americans, and then Yoda, I'll get you in here too to get your perspective. But you know, Chanel, maybe to start with you, are there certain policies, certain government approaches, certain regulatory frameworks that you think could help accelerate both investment in interoperable solutions as well as adoption?
Yeah, my wish list has 3 things on it. The first is multi-device integration and consideration. So I know a lot of the regulatory agencies are set up where their departments are device specific, but the new world that we're entering in, you know, EVs and thermostats and stationary batteries and all of these things now need to live and play together. And so if there's a siloed approach to looking at how do we regulate stationary batteries, how do we regulate EVs, how do we regulate thermostats, we're going to end up with a very clunky ways of trying to integrate all of this on the back end. And so proceedings and decisions, teams should be considering multi-devices, and the utility should be also allowed to create programs and tests and pilots and studies that can control multiple devices. So that's one, multi-device. The 2 is incentives. We've had a interesting ride with solar, and the interesting ride is effectively early adopting customers got really great incentives. And as the adoption reached a critical mass, it was very clear that non-adopters were subsidizing adopters, and that needed to be changed. Because those incentives had been baked in, and I think folks felt that they were somewhat in an entitlement, it was a very, very hard challenge to change things. And so I think there's a hesitancy with some policymakers and regulators to offer incentives for new devices or new uses of devices. And I would encourage, rather than shying away from incentives, let's offer attractive incentives to early adopters to help us test, learn, pilot, and study quickly, but make sure that we identify up front that these are going to be phased out, that these are not incentives in perpetuity, or that the incentives are not going to be as attractive in perpetuity as we get mass adoption of the technology and the use cases. So number 2 is incentives, and then number 3 is the flexibility to quickly test, learn, pilot, study, and scale. The regulatory process can sometimes take a year or 2 or 3 to get a decision to move forward on a proposal. And we cannot scale, test, and learn quickly in those conditions. And so having more flexibility to try something, change it up, try something new, you know, add additional customers without having to go through a very lengthy regulatory process each time will help with scaling.
Definitely. Britt, what are you hoping to see from regulators and policymakers, either here locally in New York or even at the federal level?
I'm going to +1 Chanel's answer. I think she hit on all 3 things. And I'll add on that the first point, having technology agnostic offerings or broad offerings. We're now recognizing, even in our limited offerings today, we have program, rate, altogether price signals that conflict. Customer might look like, well, what am I supposed to do? And they're going to have to do some detailed analysis. It's not simple enough. And so you really want this like harmonized view of your programs, harmonized across different technologies, across rates and programs. So it's very clear, what are you asking the customer to do? Where's the value that you want that customer to deliver? So fully agree with that. On the incentives, one thing I've thought about, we already pay a lot of incentives for infrastructure build out and managed charging. One option is to start requiring adherence to some of the existing standards as customers are installing that. That can sometimes have a cooling effect on the market, especially if one station developer is used to using one piece of hardware. They need time to make that transition, so making sure they have a lot of advanced time. But you could also do incentive adders. Like we've structured our incentives for our programs to really fine tune. We have speed adders, load management adders in our infrastructure programs to get exactly what we want from those developers. So you could do compliance adders, and that's using the carrot rather than stick. So we got to keep the market moving, keep installations and adoption increasing, but how do we reward participants for taking that step, especially if whatever they might be adopting is a little bit more expensive because it adheres to the standards as they start to come out. I mean, we have some in place now, and hopefully there will be more established. Yeah.
And your carrot stick point is so important. I think adding in those incentives, not just enforcement, to really drive that is a great way to think about it. Yonadav, what of these resonate with you, kind of coming from the UK? Any of these things that you'd like to see there? Or are there other priorities on your list for the government?
Yeah, they resonate. I think slightly different maybe perspective into the same topics. I think one is on pricing. So certainly we got a whole range of pricing mechanisms or regulations around how we can price, and to some extent it limits what we can do sometimes from an investment perspective. It also limits sometimes what we can do in terms of incentives. Yeah, I think definitely I'd like to see regulators think about pricing in the context of the energy transition as a whole, and specifically when we think about flexibility. That would be my number one. Second one is I would like, and that's something that's already happening in the UK, something called Secure Smart Electricity System, which kind of helps formalize the role of something like Mercury in the electricity system in terms of standardization and in terms of enabling those new participants work together in this new way, in a secure way. And my third one is to, it's already there. We also have very strict anti-competition laws, but I'd love for it to also wake up to the idea that the competition, the battleground is now shifting, and vendors may be creating new ways of establishing walled gardens or paywalls or all of the things we used to in other places. They could be coming into this industry, and I think ultimately harming customer choice, and creating costs for the industry and for all of us as a whole. So these would be my three wishes.
Great, thank you so much. We have a couple of minutes left. Just wanted to make sure, we've got a microphone, wanted to make sure if any of you had any questions for our great panelists, you got a chance to ask them. Feel free to raise your hand, we can get you a mic. Yeah, please, right over here. And we'll go back there. And if you could introduce yourself quickly and ask a brief question, would be great.
Yeah, thank you so much for taking the question. I'm Flavian from Hypervolt, one of the really big European charging companies. One of the big reasons why industry has proprietary APIs is obviously cost and maintenance. So the bit that you probably have seen is financial stability hasn't really been a trend, let's say, in the early incumbents in the industry. How do you guys think about that? Somewhat against the point of Mercury, but a lot of the reason for connectivity layers is so that the vendors can sustain their companies in the long run, which is not something that translates across, I guess, to the utility side.
Yeah, I think that it is an important consideration, and having a sustainable market, being able to supply the equipment, the network systems, having that continuity is important if you want customers to be getting like operations and maintenance and all those great things, and have their sort of networks continue operating successfully. I guess I'm thinking ultimately this energy transition, we do need to make investments in the grid. and at the same time, we can harness flexibility to offset some of those costs. And there's various places in the grid where that value can be harnessed, but taking kind of a societal cost view, which ultimately determines a lot, for example, on the utility programs that we would offer, having the ability for utilities to harness that benefit in the most efficient way without doing what we're doing, like customers uploading files and us, checking them for errors and fraud and all this complicated work. Having a more efficient system in the end will make the whole ecosystem more efficient. So I know that's a little bit of a squishy answer probably, but having all these unique ad hoc different solutions and trying to orchestrate all of them to squeeze out the value of that grid flexibility it's not going to happen. It's not going to be sustainable. And so that healthy ecosystem and more value for your customer or the utility to the grid will in the end make the EV ecosystem more sustainable. And same goes for other technologies as well.
Do you want to add another quick thought?
Yeah, I think standards usually come as the market matures. So I think early days, it's the only way to create a compelling customer experience. There is no other choice. You end up creating a more closed system, but you can support it, and the customers come to depend on it. I think and we've had some numbers earlier about how about the growth. I think there comes a point where your addressable market becomes restricted or is clipped, if you like, or is capped if you're using proprietary interfaces. We're not there yet, but I think a lot of us are seeing us reaching that tipping point where actually to maximize, don't even think about the greater good, but just think about from a selfish perspective, you will be able to address more customers if you've got a channel to those customers which open APIs or standard APIs will be able to reach. I mean, I'm sure there's examples from other industries, video, every industry will have this tipping point where all of a sudden jumping on the standard is more cost effective than using your proprietary solution.
Definitely.
I'll just add to that there's also the risk of not adopting a standard which if we have a vendor who needs to shut his doors, we don't have a lot of customers left with equipment that they can no longer use. And we've seen that happen in the EV charging space, and it's been disruptive. So I think it helps with customers that there's a standard as well.
Definitely. I'm going to stop us there because we got time for one more question. I think I saw another hand right here. Yeah, please, Mark. We got a microphone coming up for you right here.
Thank you very much. And I hate to be the guy up front that asked the question, but there is some initiation for EPRI and the initial, prior to EPRI or prior to decoupling, making economics a more valuable thing. It was left up to the utilities to do all of this. So Mercury is really taking on a heavy load only because now it's going to be sort of, you have the capacity to bring all these utilities together. To rely on the utilities to do this might be a little bit dangerous as far as data collection, vital data collection as well. But on the original side of decoupling, it's already in existence, and that's your safety net. You're becoming the safety net only because you're not allowing the utilities to make up the rules. You're making the rules, which is really exciting about what consortium has, the Mercury consortium has in its initiative. If you follow me on that, you mentioned smart cities. All over Europe it's happening, but you still have to collect vital data. It still has to be valid and has to meet many requirements. But if it's already established, go along with that. I'm sure you're taking some of that responsibility yourself. Better than just letting the utilities do that, because prior to EPRI, it was blackouts, and it was a very big topic. We don't want to go back into those days again.
Any reactions to that perspective?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think it's our opportunity, our obligation to do exactly that. Sorry, lots of my thread of thought there. But I absolutely agree. This is absolutely the right thing to do, I think.
Great. Chanel, any final perspectives or reactions there?
Nothing to add on that one.
Great.
Thank you.
Perfect. Well, that's a great note to end on. Thank you all so much for sticking with us. Thank you so much to our amazing panel bringing such a diverse array of utility perspectives. And shameless plug to keep this conversation going. I hope you all, for those, if you're not already, subscribe to Semaphore Net Zero, which is our twice weekly newsletter covering the energy transition. You can sign up at semaphore.com. It's free. It's worth every penny. But thanks again. Round of applause for our panelists. Thank you all so much.
20-minute break before we resume with our last panel, regulatory policy, before we will go into networking. So please be back in 20 minutes and we'll resume. Thank you. Thank you, folks.
The final panel of the Mercury Innovation Symposium is about to begin. Please take your seats.
I'm sorry, Commissioner. What? Actually, why don't we? All right, folks, if we could take a seat. We want to make sure we don't stand in the way of the reception networking, which starts right after this session, and also want to be respectful to our folks that are on the online stream. So let me set the stage. We've talked today from 3 different perspectives so far. We have the OEM's perspective, we have the utilities perspective, we talked about what was going on in the EV supply equipment technology working group, and the common thread that held everything together was the consumer. And ultimately, when you think about regulation and policy, the consumer is at the center of what regulators and policymakers are focused on. I was thinking a little bit about this, and one of the areas as I think about the energy business that we have been successful in bringing this group of stakeholders together, whether it be the OEMs, regulators, policymakers, utilities, and the consumers, really was around energy efficiency. To me, it's one of the great achievements within the energy sector when you look at what we achieved in terms of driving efficiency across global organizations in terms of energy. So I think we have a history of where we have seen this type of collaboration and consideration work, and where regulatory policy has played a key role in terms of being able to drive that forward. So we're going to explore that a little bit more, regulatory policy role in terms of driving interoperability standards going forward to support the Mercury Consortium. And before I do that, I did want to, first of all, introduce my panelists up on stage here. I have Commissioner Vlhova with the New York Public Service Commission. I also have online 2 folks that are with us. Tom Howell, who is with Energy Advisor within the European Commission. And then Martin Adams. Martin, you have a longer title. Why don't you go ahead and tell me your title?
Hi there. So I'm Martin Adams, as you said. I'm the head of technical policy for something we have in the UK called the Smart Secure Electricity Systems Programme.
Well,
it's all about
well, great, and welcome to all 3 of you. And I thought what we would start first is I like to ground our participants here in New York as well as those on the live stream in terms of what your respective role is. And I'm going to ask you to do it in 2 parts. 1, just give us a little bit more insight into your respective role. And then 2, talk a little bit about your thoughts on flexibility. Very briefly, but the role of flexibility in terms of enabling affordability, reliability, resiliency going forward. Why don't I start with you, Commissioner? What's your perspective? What's your current role within the New York Public Service Commission? And then your thoughts on flexibility.
Sure, and can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. Thank you for sticking with us through the afternoon. I'm Radina Vlhova, and I am the newest member of the New York Public Service Commission. I joined in June of last year, so I'm almost going on a year. Thank you. And our role as commissioners is to, number 1, ensure that New York's electric, gas, telecommunications water and steam utilities are providing safe and reliable service at just and reasonable rates. That is our baseline statutory standard, and that we are working towards achieving New York's clean energy, climate, and environmental justice goals. And as part of that, we have a number of proceedings that I will speak on later that relate to flexibility. I would say if I had to encapsulate how I view flexibility as part of our work in response to your question, I would say it's the question of how can we use it to provide value to individual customers who invest in flexible resources themselves, and how can flexible resources provide value to the energy system by making it more energy and economically efficient, and how can they provide value to the environment.
I love that perspective, consumer, prosumer, in terms of how they can provide value, how we think about that going forward. I am going to want to explore with all of you a little bit about the customer experience and the role of regulatory policy in enabling that. Tom, you're on my next round, so why don't you go ahead and just introduce your role within the European Commission and also your views on flexibility.
Okay, thanks a lot, and good afternoon, everyone. Yes, I'm over here in Brussels. We in the European Commission are creating the regulatory framework for the energy system in Europe that has different dimensions. Partly it's integrating the different national electricity systems, so France and Spain and Germany, for instance, linking them all together, making sure that they're working coherently and consistently, but also getting all of the electricity systems in Europe ready to cope with a much more decarbonized energy mix. We're heading towards much higher levels of wind and solar and more nuclear and so altogether more decarbonized. All of that requires much more flexibility. Flexibility will help the system operate more efficiently and more cheaply fundamentally in terms of having smarter grids, more efficient use of grids. That provides flexibility to the whole system. But bringing in demand-side response, having smart appliances, whether they're heat pumps or electric vehicles or industrial scale, these are all a way of making sure the system works more flexibly, and that brings billions in savings in terms of reduced investment costs and altogether better use of resources. And we produce the regulatory framework to help set that up, whether that's formalized in network codes or, as I'll talk about a bit later, through codes of conduct with industry to bring industry together to work out what we need to do to make flexibility happen, what needs to happen to the markets, what needs to be in the appliances, which is the focus of Mercury. Thanks.
Yeah, that's great, Tom. And I think a couple key things there. How do we make flexibility a predictable resource? Not only in terms of planning purposes, but for system operations going forward. And I also heard you introduce the phrase affordability ultimately. I'm using my term, but in terms of reliability, resilience, safe, affordability is key from a consumer perspective. Martin, from your perspective, your role and then your view on flexibility in general.
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me here to speak with you this afternoon. So in the UK, we have an ambition to decarbonise our power system by 2030, and we cannot achieve clean power without flexibility. It is crucial for helping manage intermittent generation, but also it's crucial for managing costs and keeping costs down for the grid and for consumers. So for us, flexibility is key for energy security, it's key for decarbonisation, it's key for lowering consumer bills. My role and the role of my team in the UK is we have a programme which is particularly focused on how do we get the maximum amount of flexibility out of appliances in consumers' homes with large potential for flexibility and large upfront costs. So we're looking at the EV charge points, the heat pumps, the domestic battery storage systems. And Mercury is a really exciting development because a key challenge for us is going, if a consumer buys one of these appliances, currently, they can be locked in or locked out of certain parts of the market. It's a bit like the early days of mobile phones, and it's a pain if it's a mobile phone. It's an even bigger pain if it's a £12,000 heat pump that's strapped to the side of your home. So initiatives like Mercury are really key for how do we kind of manage that interoperability to ensure consumers can benefit and consumers welcome this innovation and can kind of achieve all of the benefits from competitive markets where consumers can switch and move around to.
So we heard from the UK European Union, and then also, of course, New York, US perspective, flexibility is key in terms of enabling affordability, reliability, and resiliency. And I think it's just an important point to put a stake in again, because we all agree on ultimately the North Star. We know that leveraging distributed energy resources is imperative if we are going to support the objectives that we talked about in terms of affordability, reliability, and then ultimately resiliency. So the question is, how do we get there, and what's the role of regulatory policy in terms of helping us get there? I started by talking about energy efficiency and using that as an example where this group of stakeholders has had to work together in the past that drew something very beneficial for the overall energy industry and for consumers at large. When you think about your respective regions, what tools do you have in your tool bag today that you are leveraging to support flexibility, whether it be at the device level or even at the large load level? Martin, let me start with you. I'll go in reverse order just to keep it fair in the room. So Martin, your perspective.
Thank you. I'm glad you talked not just about devices, but the systems level too. So from our perspective in the UK, we have taken powers about a year ago to enable regulation of energy smart appliances, but also organisations controlling load. Now, clearly, regulatory powers are not something government ever uses lightly, and a lot of care has got to go into how do we use those effectively, how do we use those in a way that works with the grain of industry and delivers consumer outcomes. And I'm really looking forward to getting into that conversation this afternoon. But as you mentioned, energy efficiency standards, I think it's a great example of where regulation can play a role in aligning with the direction of travel of industry, sort of helping choice edit for consumers by cutting out the bottom end of the market to ensure that standards are being lifted for everyone.
And I want to build upon a couple of those comments, but Tom, I want to hear your comment. What levers do you have? What do you see from the European Commission? Levers that you have to enable flexibility?
We try to use every tool in the toolbox. I mean, whether that's the electricity directives we have at the EU level, which firstly required member states, regulators, system operators to gear up and get ready and create flexibility markets. When that wasn't happening, we said, okay, we need to go further. We'll give you more detailed regulations through the form of a network code, which specifies in much more granular detail the conditions that regulators need to accept from system operators, and that system operators need to put in place for flexibility to come onto the market. So there's that regulatory aspect at a high level, if you like, but then there's also dealing with the appliances. Like, as Martin mentioned, we've got a long history in promoting energy efficiency of appliances through regulation. We've got the whole what's called the European eco-design regime and eco-labeling regime. And it's out of this level of regulation that we're really pushing forward the questions of smart appliances in the energy sector and how to make those interoperable and so on. So that's all the different tools are at our disposal here.
That's great. So the tools are available to a certain degree, and we'll probe a little further on those tools and how effective they are. But Commissioner, I wanted to hear your perspective in New York. What tools are you leveraging around flexibility to drive consumer behaviors?
Sure. I think it's an incredibly exciting time to be working on this topic, particularly in New York. And obviously, I'm a little bit biased, but I think we are ahead of the curve compared to most states in terms of working on enabling flexible resources. Part of that is because I think there is a spirit of innovation here in the state, both from third-party companies as well as from our utilities. I'm proud to say that looking across the country, I think we have some of the most innovative utilities here. I think we also, as a commission, have made it a priority to enable flexible resources, and we have a dedicated proceeding specifically for that. And that's what I mean when I say we're a little bit of ahead of the curve compared to other states, because we launched this proceeding last year, and the whole focus is to answer the question, what role can flexible resources play in our energy system? How can they potentially defer traditional infrastructure investments? How can they support customer affordability? And what sort of policy barriers do we need to address in order to make that happen? So I would say our biggest tool right now is this proceeding, and I want to highlight a finding from a report that was published earlier this year. For anyone interested, the proceeding is called the Grid of the Future Docket. Grid of the Future is the official title. And the potential for flexibility in New York was described as follows. New York's 2040 grid flexibility potential is more than 6 times our current capacity. And grid flexibility could avoid nearly $3 billion per year in power system costs by 2040. Nearly $3 billion per year in power system costs by 2040. Obviously, that assumes that we address all of the regulatory barriers and the market grows. It's not a guarantee, but we have a benchmark to work towards. And I will close by saying that I think an additional important tool in this proceeding is figuring out what are the right questions to ask to begin with. What do we need to sort out? What are the challenges that we need to address? And that's kind of where we are at the moment. We have an initial report and a plan to identify and address barriers, but that is the stage that we're at, and our primary tool is answering those questions.
Yeah, and I love the idea. What are the right questions to ask that can tease us out so that we understand where to focus our energy? Let me build on a comment that was made from the last panel, the utility panel, and I'm not sure, Martin and Tom, whether or not you were able to join in here, but it was Chanel Parson of Southern California Edison that commented specifically from a regulatory perspective, a utility can sometimes feel that they are slowed down by the regulatory construct. There's a need for speed right now to go forward. And to a certain degree, Mercury and the standardization around interoperability that Mercury can bring forward would be very valuable. From a regulatory perspective, how do you begin to accelerate some of do you see Mercury in that light? How do you begin to accelerate, I guess, the regulatory construct in order to meet the timing that the marketplace is going through? Tom, let me start with you, just your perspective from the European Commission.
Sure, yeah. I mean, there's been lots going on. And flexibility is the latest in terms of the dynamism of what's going on in the electricity sector. But fundamentally, there's an issue that I think a lot of the players focus absolutely on the need for, firstly, keeping the lights on. That's fundamental all the way down the chain. But also keeping lights on cheaply and as keeping everything affordable. And if those are your only 2 objectives, then you can be every player, the regulator, the system operator, and the supplier can be reluctant to bring in innovation because they don't want anything to threaten those 2 prime drivers. So for us, a lot of the conversation has been about changing this, challenging the sense that you cannot have these innovations at the same time as you're providing guaranteed energy and cheaper energy, that they're helping regulators understand and system operators understand that they've got to change their parameters. They've got to allow, for instance, certain types of investments to take place to bring in flexibility into the market, even if that seems to increase, for instance, their regulated asset base, but if there's a saving to the system in the medium term. And thinking that through with regulators and system operators is a fundamental part of it.
That's great. And Radina, just to kind of build upon that. So I want us to take it to the step of, as regulators, if a device is licensed by Mercury, so it's been tested, certified, licensed by Mercury that it meets a certain set of technical specifications between the utility and the device that can support grid services from the device, how would a regulatory body be able to embrace that and use that to speed the process? What's your perspective in that area?
Yeah, that's, I think, one of the key questions that I hope we'll be able to answer through the Grid of the Future process, or proceeding rather. I've read through both the Grid of the Future study as well as the plan that was filed earlier this year. In full transparency, because the recommendations in both those documents may eventually find their way before the Commission for a decision, I can't speak too deeply about what I think the right approach is. because that might conflict me out of being able to vote on that topic. But I can say that standardization and giving utilities the assurance that systems that connect to their grid that have been certified and bear the stamp of approval of a third-party entity that is trusted would potentially make a very big difference in speeding up the grid connection process and enabling new technologies to make it onto the market and for customers to adopt them. And we do have some experience that is analogous to that with energy storage. I believe California is pretty far ahead in this regard, where they have made it easier for customers who wish to adopt energy storage to move through the interconnection process by publishing a list of pre-approved export control mechanisms. So similarly to what you're describing, these are technologies that have been IEEE certified, that have been UL lab tested, or that are IEEE compliant and UL certified, giving the utilities confidence that these technologies will perform as stated in the customer's interconnection agreement, that they will export when they say they will import when they say they will, and they won't when they're not supposed to. And seeing that experience with energy storage, I suppose, gives me hope that having a similarly robust and trusted source could work through Mercury. In full transparency, I guess it depends on how much people trust Mercury as a trusted source. I don't have an answer to that, but in theory, that's how it would work.
Yeah, and I love that example, and it shows in terms of the levers that regulatory policy constructs have to drive different behaviors. If it is one where they feel confident that we can move forward, we can move you up in the queue for interconnection process because you have achieved the certification or labeling, then to me that's a lever that we might want to consider pushing forward to really take advantage of flexibility. Martin, I'm curious from your perspective in the UK, how do you see this notion of being able to potentially leverage certification, testing certification and licensing to help try to speed up the regulatory policy construct?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think certainly in the UK, our ambition is to work with industry to agree a common set of functional and technical standards and requirements that devices can be built against in order to give consumers confidence that they can work with any flexibility service. Now, to my mind, there's a real danger when government tries to pick winners. It's something we've got to resist. If government tried to choose between VHS and Betamax, we probably have chosen Betamax, right? So I think government's got to be wary about trying to pick a particular standard. But what hopefully you can see aligning, and there's different efforts. There's Project Mercury. There's different tools, so OpenADR and various protocols and the like. But hopefully what we can see is a coalescence of all of these initiatives. And I think that's what innovation's all about, really. It's about trying in various areas, finding what works, and then bringing people together to learn the lesson from that. In an ideal world, you would end up with, whether it's Mercury, whether it's something else, but you would end up with a common set of approaches where, I mean, what we're doing isn't rocket science ultimately, despite Mercury's name. It should be relatively straightforward to kind of coalesce around a common set of functional requirements, and Mercury is a great initiative that gives us a lot of food for thought in the UK about what those might look like. I suspect you never see something which says, here is a badge for approval, use this one, but you could see something which comes up with a set of common standards against which multiple people looking to do certification could corral around.
Yeah, and I think the point that you made about picking a winner, we have to be very careful of. And Mercury's intent, the Mercury Consortium intent, is not to pick winners and losers. I mean, in fact, what we have really identified is that our role isn't to pick a winner from a business model perspective, from a platform perspective. It's to establish minimum technical specification that support what a device can provide to a utility in terms of grid services. And that's ultimately what we're testing, certifying, and licensing. How you go to market with that is up to you. But I think from a regulatory perspective, very important. We're not intending to pick winners and losers. I'm going to build upon just one more concept that gets into something that came out in the utility panel. Everybody has talked about the customer experience. And I think it was one of our utility members, maybe Britt, that mentioned that it's a relatively new concept for utilities. And I'm going to use this. I worked for a utility back in the late 80s and up until the mid 90s. And really a customer was referred to many times as just a load or a ratepayer. You know, the need to identify loyalty and establish loyalty wasn't a primary objective of the utility at that point in time. But now there is a very big focus on the customer experience, and we've heard it from our OEMs today. They recognize the customer experience is vital to drive adoption of technology and then ultimately to participate in any sort of demand response programs. We heard it from our utilities how important it is. We know our technology providers, energy service providers feel the same way. Let me ask the question from this perspective. We talked about regulators being accountable for reliable, resilient, safe, and affordable energy. Where does the customer experience begin to take hold in terms of a regulator's priorities? How do we help shape that experience working with the stakeholders in the industry? And Martin, maybe I'll start with you on that question and work backwards on the panel here. But what are your thoughts? What is the role of regulators, policymakers in helping to shape the customer experience?
I feel it's something which is really key, but if a regulator gets it right, it's also invisible. So people notice when things go wrong, when they suddenly can't switch service provider or supplier, when they have blackouts. So a regulator's role, a customer's at the heart of it, and the customer's kind of the focus about what we're doing. We're there. You care about energy security, you care about grid stability, you care about these things for the benefit of the customer ultimately. Now, of course, as a regulator, you can end up being rather removed from a customer. So it's really important to find ways to stay connected, whether that's focus groups or surveys or talking to trade bodies and customer representatives. But ultimately, and I think there is a recognition everywhere, and part of the big drive around interoperability around these standards is a shared vision and shared set of outcomes that government, industry, regulators, consumer bodies are all looking to work towards, which is a privileged place to be at the moment.
Yeah, and I think ultimately as we think about the customer experience and the regulatory policy constructs, there's examples of where that has been done today, where the regulators have played a role that has impacted customer experience. And I think it's important to think about those as we think about how it can help shape the future around flexibility. Tom, I'm curious from your perspective, the role of the regulator, policy constructs in shaping customer experience.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the starting point is that we've established liberalized, open retail and wholesale electricity markets in each country of the EU, and so that should mean that it's when there's retail competition out there, there are multiple customers, multiple companies out there competing for customers, and therefore customer satisfaction provides an immediate return to the energy suppliers playing in the market. And we see that in terms of the different types of contracts that get offered in the retail markets. You get a customer appetite for instance, 100% renewable energy contracts, or contracts that split between a dynamic pricing or stable pricing, long-term or short-term pricing. So when you see that kind of variety, that's reflecting the different interests and preferences of consumers. So that's hopefully competition in the retail market responding to what consumers want, and that hopefully will also be bringing on flexibility as a desirable characteristic. Once it becomes more familiar with consumers, they'll want to start demanding that, and retailers should start supplying it.
Yeah, and I think what Tom indicated there, you have the incentives that obviously have shaped the customer experience from an economic perspective. I think as we think about this customer experience going forward, the Bluetooth example about how simple it is to engage wireless devices in your house using Bluetooth technology, and you have a seamless customer experience that makes you willing to participate, to purchase products that are Bluetooth enabled. And so as I think about the customer experience, I think about expanding beyond the economic incentives. I think one of the things that strikes me today is when they talk about the participation, utilities participation in demand response programs, load management programs, et cetera, it typically is fairly low. And our role, of course, within the Mercury Consortium is not only to help support customer adoption of load flexible devices, but then by extension support their entry and participation in demand or energy service markets. So I'm curious, Radina, from your perspective, anything you see going on in New York that you see impacting the customer experience beyond kind of the economic levers that are out there?
Sure. I have a rather personal answer to this question. I have a bachelor's in psychology, so I remain very interested in human behavior and how we shape human behavior. And that's getting more to price signals and program design, but also how do you get people interested in caring about their energy? So again, from a very personal perspective, my first introduction to energy was growing up with a single mom in a relatively low-income household where we did have to make some tough choices sometimes about how we heated our home in the winter. I grew up in Southern California, so we're not talking about, heating home in Alaska, for example, but it got cold, and sometimes we turned on the oven for heat instead of running central heat. So my first introduction was through energy scarcity, and it wasn't until I began working in the energy space that I began to think about, energy efficiency, demand response, all these other programs. So it makes me really interested about how an average person who's not an expert in this field, first of all, gets information about available programs to them, whether it's demand response or participating in a VPP program. How do they find out about it? And when they find out about it, how do they choose to participate? And I'm going to actually now provide a quote from a customer who is currently participating in one of our virtual power plant programs in New York that is a partnership between Sunrun and Orange and Rockland Utilities. The customer said, "We quickly signed up once we learned that a Sunrun solar and battery system could protect our home from outages while also bolstering the grid for our community. It's gratifying to know that without us lifting a finger, our home is supplying clean solar energy back to the grid to benefit everyone." And I thought that was such a salient statement, without us lifting a finger. So the utility and the third-party provider were able to provide a seamless experience for the customer, which reduces friction to enrollment. And the customer is seeing personal value to themselves, which I think is obviously very important. It's not necessarily just about the financial value. In this case, it's a resilience value. And they take pride and ownership of being able to contribute to the grid as a whole. This program has, I think, over 300 participants. There's another VPP program in New York located in Con Edison and Orange and Rockland's territories offered by Logical Buildings. That doesn't require hardware, it's software only. It's an app-based program where customers can sign up and they get a signal from Logical Buildings saying, we're going to be experiencing peak demand from such and such a time today. Here's what you can do. You can run your dishwasher later. You can charge your car at a different time. And customers are responding, and that program has, I think, I might get it wrong, but I think 13,000 participants. And the reason I think this is so important is twofold. Number one, we just launched our grid flexibility proceeding last year. We don't have the answers yet to all the questions that we've asked, and we're already seeing people signing up for those programs. And we're seeing innovation. In the ONR Sunrun program, there is hardware and software. In the program run by Logical Buildings, it's just software. So there is innovation in this space, and people are signing up. And that's the part that's fascinating to me. Without having some sort of statewide VPP program, people are already signing up. And that to me is a sign that we can drive customer behavior, and I guess I'm pretty hopeful.
Yeah, and I love that. A couple examples that you gave there. One, societal value. So value streams aren't only from a consumer perspective. Hey, I have some economic benefit personally, but I'm also contributing something to society, which I think is important to consider as we think about all the value streams that can be created. But I also think that we have an incredible opportunity as a stakeholder group. That's something that can come out of the Mercury Consortium, that we need to communicate differently with consumers who don't really understand energy at the end of the day. How many of you really can relate to what a kilowatt hour is? Yeah, if you're in the industry, you can kind of relate to it. But in reality, if I'm a homeowner, there's a utility in Arizona, Salt River Project, that said, especially for my low to moderate income customers that are trying to manage energy usage, what's more important on their wall is a meter that shows how much money they're using. So when they turn on that air conditioning, it gives them real-time information. So it's not a kilowatt hour, it's here's how much money it's costing you. That drives different behaviors. It came out this morning as we talked to the technology panels of the OEMs that, hey, at the end of the day, it might cost more for me to invest in a heat pump, but if my operational costs are lower, then there's value for me as a consumer. But when we talk about it to a consumer, we talk about your electric bill. Your electric bill goes up, but your energy wallet should go down. So we have this need to change the dialogue that's going on within the energy industry amongst the stakeholder groups to talk about kind of the customer experience and what the benefits can be. And I think it's an opportunity as we think about the Mercury Consortium going forward. How do we enable that discussion down at a consumer level? How do we work with regulatory policy? Utilities, OEMs are on the front line in terms of dealing with the consumers and the vendors, et cetera. How do we enable a different discussion going forward? And Radina, you mentioned innovation. Hey, innovation is occurring despite a drive to try to standardize as much as possible. So say a little bit, I mean, obviously there we can have, and Tom and Martin, I want to hear your perspective. Innovation can occur regardless of whether or not we are driving towards technical specifications that standardize that utility device interface. So say a little bit more from your perspective about the role of innovation going forward.
Sure. I recently had the opportunity, and I'm going to look to Martin here a little bit for his experience in England. I had a little bit of opportunity to learn about the power system in Great Britain specifically, so I'm leaving Ireland out. I just really learned about the GB energy system, and they have a remarkable faith in the market's ability to produce innovative results. I think compared to, and I see Martin smiling. That's my characterization from an outsider looking in, having a brief but very, very intense dive into the system there. And so when I think about innovation, it seems to me that what they've done there pretty well, and what we're trying to do in New York through not just the Grid of the Future proceeding, but other dockets related to planning, for example, and considering price signals. They're back. Is also to spur innovation. And in both instances, I think in Great Britain as well as what we're trying to achieve in New York, is to lay the foundation for companies to be able to innovate with consumer protections and with standardizations that streamline some of the processes around connecting flexible resources to the grid and around allowing them to serve as grid assets that streamline it both from the customer experience, and by customer I mean a residential customer, a commercial customer, but also the third-party operator who's looking to install these systems, and from the utilities perspective as well, because processing, I think it was the representative from Southern California Edison earlier said, for example, processing interconnection applications can take time. That is utility engineering time, and they're challenged from a staffing perspective, particularly as you get a larger and larger volume of interconnection applications. I'm using interconnection as an example here, but a lot of the resources we're talking about will need to interconnect in order to be able to provide their flexibility services. So To sum it up, I think enabling innovation through a foundational regulatory structure that streamlines the process by which flexible resources can connect to the grid and then provide their services to the grid is what we're trying to achieve, and what seems like the GB energy system has done really well so far, that we're trying to learn from a little bit.
I love that, predictive and proactive. Martin, you smiled during that. Tell us your perspective in terms of innovation being able to coexist in a world where technical standardization is also.
Well, first of all, thank you for that praise for the GB energy system. I think that there's a big focus here on, I guess, two things come to mind. Firstly, how do you make sure that sort of regulatory approaches provide a floor, not a ceiling on innovation? So they should, I agree with that term, foundational, that we need a common baseline, but you need space to innovate above that. I think secondly, regulation, inevitably regulation creates grit. It's part of the point of it. And then it's about how do you recognize that? It's about having that very open dialogue with industry to go what's working and what's not working, and to be able to swiftly remedy things where you have inadvertent behaviors occurring, or regulation providing a barrier to innovation. So I think it's always about that dialogue and about being willing to listen and change, because inevitably we're learning, and innovation is a sort of a process of learning, and it's a process of learning together.
Yeah, and Tom, as you think about this and kind of build on the innovation and the standardization, think about it from the perspective also, ultimately, how we leverage the Mercury Consortium objectives and vision to help drive innovation also. So I'm just curious, your thoughts in that area.
Well, to pick up what Martin was saying, there's grit in the system. There's in a sense, the European electricity sector is modeled a bit on the way the UK market works. So there's competition in there, which should be a driver of innovation. But there's the need for that ongoing dialogue with the regulators and system operators, so they know what the potentials are, and forums like Mercury, who can bring forward even just the ideas, the different types of flexibility available. Firstly, there's a good discussion that carries on there with regulators about what the regulators might need to do to unblock something that might be a barrier to that novelty coming onto the market. So it's good to have that dialogue between the industry and the regulators, so that people know what's new, what's coming on, and to be sure that there's no regulatory barriers to that happening. But then the kind of consistency, the interoperability that comes up through something like Mercury is a great accelerator of innovation in the industry, because that it builds up trust, it builds up confidence. And in the cautious sector, which is electricity, that's really useful.
That's great. And I see that balance of driving standardization where possible, but then also enabling innovation on the other side. And that's part of the regulatory policy construct. I want to make sure that we have time if there's any questions in the audience. We have a question right here. If we can go ahead and make sure that we get them a microphone. There we go. Go ahead, sir. Please introduce yourself and then direct your question.
Thanks. Jim from 2050 Partners, supporting the California IOUs on their flex demand standards. The question might be is, how can the regulators facilitate an environment of support for an evolving standard to set up the right environment to learn the gaps fast and to get their state's perspectives into the mix as soon as possible? So how can they stop the music for a second and get the right people in the room for their state? Going to be selfish for a minute, but it'll help the rest of the country.
Yeah, and Jim, you actually took away my final question, so we're going to use that to build upon that. But seriously, Jim's question here, and I'm thinking about it from the Mercury Consortium perspective. How do we engage regulatory policy constructs in a proactive manner to be part of the Mercury Consortium, to be part of the collaborating, the convening, to be able to represent the global or regional nuances, et cetera, rather than wait until the end, then to come back to regulators and policies and say, here's what we come up with. Jim, is that characterizing your thought process? Okay, so why don't we start? Tom, I'm going to go with the European Commission first. Thoughts on that? How do we engage you proactively during the process rather than at the end?
Well, obviously I'm biased, but I reckon we're a pretty approachable and flexible institution. I mean, in whatever format we do it, whether we're talking of creating draft laws where we consult, or network codes, or whether it's just talking through the latest results of a Mercury steering committee on X, it's pretty easy for, I think, for industry to come and talk either directly to the Commission or to our research centres, or to engage with regulators on the topic of flexibility, because we've got so many different work streams there where all the different aspects of flexibility, and particularly the barriers and the constraints to flexibility are being talked through and aired. So I think we're pretty easily approached through any manner to talk through what needs to change and what's coming up.
Yeah, and I think back to one of the comments this morning during the technology working group. One of the panelists referred to one of the big values of just being part of the technology working group was to break down the barriers of competition and begin to actually have the real discussions around what are the challenges we're trying to address here. But they indicated there was even a vocabulary issue that had to be addressed up front to make sure that we were all speaking the same language. So this notion of being part of the collaborative as it evolves is going to be very important. And Martin, I'm curious, from the UK perspective, how do we get you engaged in the Mercury Consortium on a regular basis rather than at the end of when we might issue a technical specification? Thoughts?
Yeah, I think that idea of cross-pollination and cross-fertilization and iterating together is really important here. From the UK perspective, we've really welcomed the openness of Mercury, so being able to join and have observer status and see the process from the inside as it evolves has been very valuable. And likewise, with our own sort of sticking closely with the device standards, with our own technical working groups advising us on, from an industry perspective, on how do we create the right regulatory frameworks to bring about this standardization. We've got a lot of overlaps in membership. We've had workshops with some of your technical working group arriving and attending, and so having that joined up approach, I think there's inevitably work that's happening in parallel, but also there's a strength in that. That's part of innovation, right? Going back to the previous conversation. So I think having that sort of ability for people to work separately, come at ideas from their different perspectives, from an industry perspective, from a government perspective, but bring all of that together as we go along, as we grow together, is key.
Great. Radina, from your perspective, New York perspective, how do we engage you? How do we get you part of the consortium? Like I said, we don't want you to be on the sidelines. We want you to be an active collaborator within the consortium.
Yeah, I think one really helpful thing that's New York specific, but I think also relevant to California, is we do have ongoing working groups for interconnection. There's an interconnection policy working group, an interconnection technical working group that meets on a regular basis, where issues like this I think are very appropriate to raise. Also through the Grid of the Future proceeding, I think having the Mercury consortium come in and submit comments, I'm obviously not forcing you to do that, but that's certainly one way that you can introduce the initiative to a wider audience that I think is very valuable. And we're looking for input right now, live, as we speak on these issues that I think would be, really, really helpful.
Yeah, and I wanted to highlight, just for the group, there's two classes of membership for the Mercury Consortium. One is an observer class, what we call an observer class. And one of the opportunities that we have is understanding the importance of having regulatory policy constructs, as well as other organizations, NGOs, et cetera. We have the opportunity to work with the Mercury board to potentially waive membership fees in order to make sure that that voice is heard at the table. So we do have opportunities to operationalize this particular group of stakeholders and to bring you in so that we can make sure that we're actively engaged with you going forward.
If I can add, I don't think I actually fully understood the question initially. We do have an amazing technical staff on our team, so I think obviously I'm happy to share the information about the consortium within our department and see who's available and free to participate. it's always hard. And I think I'm sure both Martin and Tom and folks working in this space in the room will appreciate that time is limited, and we want to make sure that anything that we ask them to participate in gives bang for the buck. And in my opinion, this certainly is that. So that's another way is having our technical staff participate, because quite frankly, they're probably the ones you want to have on board, not the commissioners, because they're the ones that actually have the in-depth experience to have meaningful conversations.
Wonderful point. Wonderful point. We have time. Serge told me I could use 5 minutes of his time, so we have time for one more question. Right? Actually, Kit, right there.
Thanks. Kit Kennedy with NRDC, and just a quick comment and a question. The comment is, from an environmental perspective, how exciting it is to see the Mercury Consortium being launched, and at a time, obviously, with a lot of uncertainty at the federal level, to see the international cooperation, the utility and stakeholder discussion around standardization, and around electrification in general. It just gives a lot of cause for optimism. And my question is about achieving scale on demand response, flexibility, virtual power plant programs. And Commissioner Vlhova, you mentioned the Grid of the Future proceeding, the pilot programs, which are small but it seems like customers are really interested. How do we kind of make this really go big so that many customers are aware of the program and having that good customer experience?
Yeah, why don't you start, Commissioner, and then I'll send it to Tom and on to you, Martin, to close us out. But Commissioner, your thoughts on that?
Sure. The very unsatisfying answer first is that's the question that the Grid of the Future proceeding ultimately is meant to answer. So both of the documents that I mentioned that were released earlier this year, the Grid of the Future study and the Grid of the Future plan, are aimed to answer that question. What are all the various barriers that we need to address in order to scale these resources or deploy them at scale? I think the more satisfying answer is that's where it kind of comes back to human psychology and program design. From my perspective as a regulator, it is our job to lay the foundation for third parties, whether it's utilities or third-party companies, to innovate and create programs that are going to be well designed to reach customers effectively. And we can't get so granular with every program that we design it for them, but we can set good requirements for evaluation, measurement, and verification, and good carrots and sticks to make sure that they are in fact reaching customers effectively. So I'm sorry I couldn't give both satisfying answers, but
yeah, and a great point. And Tom, I'm curious from your perspective, scaling in a timely fashion, recognizing the opportunity out there, as well as the risk. The risk being that if flexibility isn't available as a resource, predictable resource, significant cost has to be borne that impacts affordability. So Tom, how do we accelerate?
For me, I think there's a front office and a back office side to this. The front office is that there's already quite a few retailers in European markets who are keen to, even where there's the smaller flexibility that's already available, they're getting out there, coming up with novel products, novel pricing structures, novel marketing gimmicking techniques to actually attract a growing customer base, and it's successful and growing. So on the one hand, there's the retailers getting out there on the front office, and then every time they're encountering technical issues, constraints, or regulatory issues in the back office, then they bring it to someone like Mercury. We've got our own code of conduct regime looking at appliances, or they take it to system operators, but to tackle front up the back office issues as well. So I think two fronts are needed by the regulators.
That's great. And Martin,
retailers.
Great, thanks, Tom. Martin, bring us home in terms of your thoughts.
I think there were probably three elements that need to come together to scale flex. You need the right wholesale market signal, so the right pricing. You need the right retail offers, and you need the right technical standards, so things like Mercury are doing. And so all three of those need to co-develop, and you often end up with chicken and egg situations where one's being held back by the other. So there's a real kind of need to keep circling around all of them and ensure they're growing. From an end consumer perspective, though, the thing that makes a big difference is going to be price salience. It's going to be when people get an electric vehicle, it's when they get a heat pump. That's when we see people really engaging with flexibility, because suddenly it matters, it makes a big difference. So the more that we can support and encourage the rollout of those technologies that provide big bang for their buck in terms of flexibility, and actually then provide the big benefits for consumers when they work flexibly, the more that we're going to see engagement rise.
Yeah, and I'm just going to close this. Kit, our perspective also is the way that we show regulators policy constructs that we're serious about what's happening here is we join the Mercury Consortium. We show what we can do, like they have done with the first technology working group in terms of establishing the EVSE technical standard, the draft of it, and being able then for regulators, when they see what we are capable of doing, to me it's a lot easier to potentially then to adopt that than what might be theoretically. So we need to push forward very aggressively. In order to do that, we need broad participation amongst all the 4 stakeholder groups, whether it be regulatory policy constructs, whether it be the OEMs, whether it be the utilities or the energy service or technology providers. We need your active participation now. That's what's going to help regulatory policy constructs make informed decisions about how to drive this forward. So with that, please join me in a round of applause for our panelists. Tom, Martin, thank you for being here. Radina, thank you. And now I want to turn it over to Serge Suberon, who is our interim CEO for the Mercury Consortium. I thought Serge should provide some closing comments before we head over to the networking session. Serge? Why don't we just stay here?
Shall I? Yeah, okay, I'm staying here. Nice to meet you, Commissioner.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.
First, thanks for this discussion, because New York discussing with DESNZ in the UK and the European Commission. I don't know if it happens every day, but that's good to see that we can get neutrality from the regulators and support at the same time for a global initiative like ours. Just want to close because I know that I'm standing between you and the drink, so I'm going to get very short. Just to say that thank you first for attending. For those who were here physically and came to New York, I think it's been an interesting event, an interesting day. I hope that we have passed the message of what we are about. Exclude the idea that we are recreating another technical standard. That is not our mission. We are on a mission to create this global functional standard for energy devices. And to be honest, as we said earlier, it's high time for the IoT to play its part in the flexibility, both creating compelling values and simplicity for the consumers, and making sure that those devices are natively integrable or eligible to the programs that we have targeted. I don't know how many hundreds energy services, products, or flexibility markets we've been looking at with NELA, but we knew that was fragmented. We have the data to show for that, and instead of focusing on what's different, we're trying to create a framework for what is common and making sure that we get support afterwards from regulators to find the right level of harmonization of those clusters of markets so that there is scale for the OEMs, there's value for the consumers, and that we get the 95% of the 200 million that are going to be sold by 2030 to participate. I think we've been told that we could retire after we reach 95%. I don't know how many years it's gonna take, Rob, but I think we are on that mission, on that path. It is about collaboration. We've seen a lot of people from different industry coming to speak about Mercury and why they're joining. We want to make sure that we have produced a first set of specifications. They're not perfect. They are 0.9 whatever version, but at least they exist. We have produced something. We are proud of what we have achieved. They are ready for dissemination. They are ready for a dialogue with the rest of the industry. It is very clear for us that we are at the stage where we need to iterate with other industry associations, with regulators, with standardization bodies to make sure that when we go to certification, this is on a solid base, but it has to be a global base, not a regional one. And that's not an easy exercise, but we count on all of us, on all of you to make it happen, because it is about collaboration in this unique sector coupling initiative that Mercury represents. So thanks a lot for your time. Thanks a lot for your questions, for your attendance. And we look forward to this dialogue as we disseminate our first specs.
Great.
Thanks.
All right, folks, so networking and reception right next door. Join us right over there, and I think it's a great opportunity to have an open dialogue session. So we'll see you over there. Thank you.